Davante Adams was released from the New York Jets, a name we have talked about a number of times, a name that at some points this offseason we've spoken of a trade that was never going to happen for $38.1 million or whatever the number was. It might happen in free agency. I don't think it's the most far-fetched thing the Pittsburgh Steelers could have surrounding them right now. He's a veteran who is super reliable. You could say, yeah, he's 32 years old, but he had 1,000 yards and 8 touchdowns last season with a bad Aaron Rodgers. And before that, it was Gardner Minshew, not the guy that you want throwing you footballs as a future Hall of Fame wide receiver. Could be a name that the Pittsburgh Steelers did consider the Pittsburgh Steelers back at the trade deadline or just before the trade deadline when the Steelers were looking for a wideout, but Davante Adams obviously wanted to go with Aaron Rodgers. I don't think Aaron Rodgers is on the table for the Steelers currently where we sit here now. That could change. A lot could change in a week. But if it's Justin Fields, does Davante Adams make sense for the Pittsburgh Steelers?
I mean, I'm glad you prefaced it with if it's Justin Fields, because I think that Davante Adams already showed his hand when it came to the Pittsburgh Steelers, saying you need to pick a quarterback before I even consider coming over to the Steelers. They picked the wrong one during the season, and because of that, Davante Adams decided he wanted to reunite with Aaron Rodgers and the New York Jets. So again, I think that this is obviously something they're going to look into, especially when you look at the market value from Spotrac. If it comes in at that $13.7 million, it makes a lot of sense. You're not paying anybody else on the offensive side of the football. And Davante Adams represents a massive, and I cannot underscore this enough, a massive upgrade on what you had at the wide receiver 2 position last year. So if he's available and if he's coming for that money, it makes all the sense in the world on the Steelers side of things. On Davante's side of things, again, it all comes down to the quarterback. Who is it and when does he sign? Because how patient is Davante Adams going to be with this process?
I agree. It does come down to the quarterback. Do you think that he'd be willing to play with Justin Fields?
I would think so. I think that he knows that his options aren't going to be somewhat limited when it comes to the free agency market, because he's going to value himself as a number 2 at the very least. And a lot of these teams aren't going to. Like the Steelers have a clear need at number 2, but some other teams might not look at Davante Adams at that age and say, yeah, you're going to be a number 2. No, they're going to say, yeah, you're going to be a great veteran number 3. And if they do, I think it's a shame on them. But I do think that the Pittsburgh Steelers offer enough opportunity to where it's going to get Davante's attention.
I agree. I wouldn't be surprised if the Steelers approached Davante with some sort of offer. I don't think that offer is going to be very high, but it wouldn't shock me. I wouldn't look at it and go, oh, the Steelers, they messed up. No, I'd look at it and say, Davante Adams is a really reliable wide receiver, one with a ton of talent left. And I don't care. I'll ride that train, that bus, whatever, till the wheels fall right off with Davante Adams, because that's how good of a wide receiver he is. And that's what you would like in a guy for Justin Fields. You want reliable guys. Like Cooper Kupp is not a crazy idea because he's a reliable set of hands. You can overlook the injuries and the price tag to say, this is a guy that Justin Fields will be able to look at and say, I have somebody here that I could count on. That is Davante Adams. And quite frankly, it's a lot better in Davante Adams. I will say this name, or we'll toss this name out there, because last night, which is wild that my report came out an hour before reports from SYN or SNY, whatever, SNY came out on the same thing, which only confirms that, well, this is probably true, that the Pittsburgh Steelers, according to sources, they have some interest in Darius Slayton, and he is certainly a name to watch for the black and gold during free agency. Wouldn't be surprised if they moved fast to try and get Darius Slayton. They view him pretty high on the list, and that list is, well, not the longest. He's 28 years old. He comes off his worst season as a professional football player, but he played with Drew Lock, Daniel Jones with no confidence, and Tommy DeVito, who had one arm by the time this was all said and done, and probably one less rib from all the sacks he was taking. Still a very reliable guy who's a former 4th-round pick, I think, 5th-round pick out of Auburn, who's made a name for himself in the NFL. He's never had a 1,000-yard season. I think you could get him for under $20 million. I think his value right now on Spotrac is 15 point something. That's a good number to me. If you could sign him for a 2, maybe a 3-year deal, and I'd be very comfortable with the 3-year deal with Darius Slayton, keep him until he's 31 years old and then decide to move on from him or move on a year early. I'm sure that they can structure a contract to make it worth their while in the back half if he is still, or if he is not still performing at the same level that they need him to. Darius Slayton, to me, I mean, I'm not alone. You've said this. Pretty much everybody in the chat has said this. We have said this a number of times. Everybody said this a number of times. Darius Slayton makes a lot of sense for the Steelers. He is a young guy. He's still got plenty of football left in him. He's reliable. He's a playmaker. Like, that's the thing. In New York, he was a playmaker. People were comparing him as a guy that would fit perfectly next to George Pickens because they can both do so much as wide receivers. I think it works a lot. I will say this, though. Okay, I'm going to ask you Darius Slayton, but it did open my eyes that he's 28 years old. I looked at him as considerably younger than Chris Godwin. Chris Godwin is 29. Like, to me, that's still a pretty young wide receiver. I get it. Maybe Darius Slayton is a little bit older. Maybe, everybody that you think is young is getting older. But to me, I was like, oh, Darius Slayton's still a young gun. This dude's still prime football, which he is. But I was like, Chris Godwin's got to be 30, pushing 31. No, he's just turned 29 years old. To me, that's young. Still, Darius Slayton's the name that I think is on the top of the Steelers list or very close to it because they aren't going to get T. Higgins. I don't think Davante Adams would be first on their list. If anything, he might be second or third. But Darius Slayton feels like a very cheap option for the Steelers. I'd ink him to a 3-year deal, and I'd be very comfortable with that. I told you about this earlier this morning, but your reaction now.
Yeah, it's much more in the realm of possibility than a guy like Davante Adams. We had those links in the 2024 season, but at the end of the day, the Steelers don't typically make the home run signing. They typically look to get that second tier, maybe top of the second tier, and I think that's exactly what Darius Slayton represents. I mean, yeah, it feels like he's been in the league a lot longer than he has, but simply probably because any skill player that's playing for the New York Giants probably ages in dog years, or it feels like they're there forever. But
yes,
no, again, Slayton is a player that we've talked about before. He's a guy that fits what the Steelers need. He is a bona fide number 2 wide receiver, and he's not somebody that's going to take away, spotlight from George Pickens, which is going to allow Pickens to go out there and be what he wants to be, which is the bona fide number 1, while at the same time, Slayton's able to kind of take some of that attention away because he can get open. So it feels like that is a match made in heaven again for the Steelers. But the problem with all these wide receivers that we talk about is they're free agents. And what have I said multiple times this offseason? How attractive is it to come to the Pittsburgh Steelers right now? Because you don't have the Super Bowl upside that was once here. You do have the Mike Tomlin of it all, which still carries weight in the free agency market. But it all comes down to dollars and opportunity. If the Steelers can offer enough money and enough opportunity, Slayton might want to come to Pittsburgh because he is not the number 1 guy on the market. It is going to be Adams, viewed by most people nationwide. It is going to be Chris Godwin, viewed by most people nationwide. And because of his time in New York, I think there's a lot of people that are kind of down on Darius Slayton, but at the same time, he's still only 28. And the Steelers need that veteran piece. This would be a nice piece that could not only bring that presence, but still be able to bring a high level of play with it.
Yeah, I agree. And look, I think the Steelers are still pretty. They're not going to give you the money to go get Chris Godwin. They're not going to give you the money to go make a crazy splash for T. Higgins if he was available. They wouldn't have the funds. They wouldn't make the funds available for something like that. But at the same time, like, I think a Darius Slayton fits perfectly once you ink a quarterback because. Like, Darius Slayton, who doesn't want to come play for the Pittsburgh Steelers? The Pittsburgh Steelers might not be like what they were, but it's in the NFL world. I've never once heard a player say, I don't want to go to the Pittsburgh Steelers. Never once. They still hold like crazy weight. And especially compared to, like, I understand that teams like the Jets look super fancy right now, and teams like the Raiders look fancy once they get a quarterback. And there's all those types of teams. But if you're not a contender, the Steelers still reign superior over most of those teams, even as a team that from the outside looking in, we could very much tell they are not going to win a Super Bowl in 2025 unless something crazy happens and everything switches, which never say never, but not likely. I would still say Darius Slayton fits in that tier where it's like the Steelers are calling. That's very interesting because he's come from a place that has been a disaster for years. And now he's going like the Steelers are stability. They're not great, but they're stability. You're going to win. You know, Dante Jackson said to me a million times this past season, man, it feels good to be on a winning team. And I think there are people out there who are just looking at it going, the Steelers don't even know how good you're telling me I get to win 10 games a year? Yeah, that sounds awesome to me. That sounds way better than Tommy DeVito throwing me the football while Evan Neal gets beat for the 11th time in a half against whoever, because it happens to every single team. I think Slayton's a good middle ground tier for the Steelers in a way that could work out in their favor when it comes to pulling him in. But, you know, I did not hear that the Steelers are locked in on this guy. I just heard that the Steelers are interested in Darius Slayton and that they are doing their homework on him to make sure that he could be the guy if they choose to go that route. I'm sure we'll hear more in the next couple of days, but we're going to hear more about everybody. You know, we're going to hear more about corners and wide receivers and quarterbacks and defensive tackles and moves that the Steelers are going to make that will be releasing guys that I expect to happen before next Tuesday as well. The chaos is just getting started, you know, like it's been a fun day on Twitter. And I feel like that's how you know that we're almost back.